All right, here we go. Chapter 39. We are on the third heading, which is after independence, long-term struggles in the post-colonial era. We're, of course, talking about end of empire, or more accurately, European empire throughout the world. And we're talking about the first subheading, which is communism and democracy in Asia. I'm actually going to do this the opposite order of what your book does, because what's interesting about Asia at this point is that, in general, except for Japan and India, most countries are going to go to an authoritarian system. I'm going to go to India first, which is one of the two places where we see a democracy. So, what's important to note is uniquely, India is going to have a large, flourishing democracy, and not going to be perfect. And there's going to be a couple of big issues, two or three big issues. First of which is going to be the diversity of India. The second one is going to be the uh, the large amount of people living in India, the overpopulation. And third, which is related to the second one, is how do I feed all these people? And so we'll see how we deal with this. So one of the first problems that they had to deal with was, what do you do about the diversity? And so we covered previously the partition which happened. So basically the Hindu people primarily went to India, and then the Muslim people went to Pakistan and East Pakistan, which is later going to be called Pakistan and Bangladesh. That was done under Nehru, who's going to he's going to become the first prime minister, and he's going to oversee things and do relatively well. The next big leader I need to talk about is his daughter, Indira Gandhi. So again, it's important to note that Indira Gandhi is not related to Mohandas Gandhi, who we learned about earlier, but Gandhi is a somewhat familiar name in India. So she becomes the leader of the Congress Party and becomes the prime minister. And one of the things that she's going to deal with is how do we feed all of these people? And so she's going to turn to something called the Green Revolution, which, if you take me for AP Human Geography, we learn a lot more about, which basically increases the agricultural yields, allows them to produce a lot more food in the land that they've got. There are some issues with it, but in general, it's seen as a success in being able to feed so many people. One of the other things that's going to happen is she's going to have some opposition to our government. And it's important to note in 75 to 77, she declares a national emergency, which basically which ends up giving her a couple years of not having elections, which obviously not good. And to make things worse, what she does in this time is she really tries to tackle one of the big issues of India, which is the overpopulation. And so she turns to something. She turns to literally sterilization, and including involuntary sterilization. Sometimes, and again, there's stories we hear about this, about people getting tricked or being forced, and so it's going to be, it's obviously a horrible thing to have happen. About 8 million people are going to be sterilized from 76 to 77, which is going to start to create, obviously, riots. And so the other thing that happens is that by 77, she allows elections to happen, she loses out, she's back in the 80s. Now, the issue here that she has is with, again, that first thing I brought up, which is the diversity of the people who are living in India. So one of those groups is called the Sikhs, which is a ethnic group slash also is a religion, can be separate from the ethnic group. And it's only about 2% of the Indian population, but they have a long history of being independent. And so there are rebels and separatists there. What's going to be her undoing is Indira is going to order an army attack against the sacred Golden Temple of Amritsar. And so what's going to happen is she's going to be able to get them, but that is going to ultimately lead to her assassination. Two of her security detail are Sikhs, and they're going to assassinate her just a few months later. And again, this kind of makes sense. I don't know. This is like, so, she attacked, in modern terms, like she attacked Jerusalem to get Jewish extremists, or something along that level. So it's not a good look, or things that people think of as something that was good that she did. Indira's son is actually also going to be popular, Rajiv Gandhi, and he's going to be able to get reconciliation with the Sikhs as part of India, but he himself is also going to be assassinated. And so it's easy to see here and say, well, wait a second, this is a failed democracy, but it's the largest democracy in the world. And one of the things that's important to note is even though we don't see their names in history, the fact that a place that's as ethnically diverse as India, with all the different languages and all the different groups and all the history of autocrats and all these Hindu princes, is a testament to these millions of Indians that we don't know who really do want democracy and make it happen. Let's jump over to the other side, which is communism. And so communism is going to rise in China after World War II under Mao, who again, before World War II, they were almost run out of existence. They helped fight the Japanese, that gets the people on their side, and so Mao takes over after World War II. And so there's two programs. I'm going to condense so much here. There are two main programs you need to know about Mao. The first one is the Great Leap Forward. The second one is the Great Proletariat Revolution, or sometimes just called the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Okay, first one, the Great Leap Forward. So just like Stalin created these 5-year plans to try to jumpstart the Russian economy and agricultural capacity, Mao tries the same thing in China. And in China, it also is a bit of a disaster. So they collectivize, they try to make it work. There's huge issues that they have. And what's going to end up happening is not only can the peasants not keep up with what needs to happen, but then Mao starts blaming everyone. He even blames sparrows. And so, hey, they need to kill the sparrows. So that isn't smart because there's a circle of life thing. And so he has tens of millions of peasants kill sparrows. And then when they do that, the insects rise up because, again, they're naturally eaten by the sparrows. And then even more of their agriculture is put under fire. And so from 59 to 62, we think there were probably around 20 million Chinese people who died from starvation and malnutrition under this failed policy. So in 66, a few years later, Mao, it doesn't say in your book, but at this point, Mao is starting to get paranoid. He's starting to realize that he clearly is not the genius that everyone is setting him up to be. And so what he does is he maintains power by creating this thing called the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution. And this is really similar to when we talked about earlier about McCarthyism. It's very similar to this. So Mao creates something called the Great Red Book, and he tells everyone there's all these saboteurs who are trying to take over the country. And so he tells people that the only one they can trust is him. He prints up this thing called the Mao's Little Red Book, and it basically has his thoughts on how everything should run. And so it's this huge, like, kind of PR campaign. Literally, who you talk to, and depending on the printings, Mao's Red Book is the most published book the world has seen to this point, if you don't count different versions of the Bible. And so part of this is anti-intellectualism, is you can't trust the teachers, the professionals. You can't, kids, you can't trust your parents. And so what ends up happening is we have this anti-intellectual wave that kind of watches over China, which really stunts their ability and their growth. And so it doesn't really die down until Mao's death in 76. And that leaves it to a guy named Deng Xiaoping to kind of pick up the pieces. And so he also had been kind of swept up in that revolution. He had to recant anything bad he'd said about Mao. And as he comes to power, he realizes, hey, things need to change. He realizes that this idea of self-sufficiency and isolation that China was trying to create and Russia trying to create wasn't working. Things weren't working fast enough. And specifically, when you looked at what was happening in the West with Western technology and culture, it was nowhere close. So what's going to end up happening is he's really going to kind of build on the detente, which had already been built by like Nixon and Mao, and to try to kind of help China kind of in some ways stay in power, the communists stay in power, but to kind of integrate into the West. What's going to happen is again, this is moving slowly in the 80s, and then Tiananmen Square happens. So what Tiananmen Square is that again, by the late 80s, it was clear that communism wasn't working, that isolationist communism wasn't working, and things needed to change. This was kind of led by different students who created what eventually turned into this huge demonstration in Tiananmen Square. And Tiananmen Square is basically is like if you took Times Square and put it in front of the White House. And so it was this huge kind of like festival and mass demonstration to have and to bring down communism. And again, it was crazy at the time, because if you'll remember from the previous, when I was talking about the 80s before, like being alive at that time, it looked like it was going to be like Germany, like the wall was just going to fall. That China was just going to, just like all these other Eastern European countries, was just realizing, hey, this doesn't work, and we were going to have communism fall in China. But that doesn't happen, does it? So what ends up happening is um, what would eventually happen is Deng is going to crush, literally with tanks, the demonstration. It's going to do it overnight. He's going to have given many warnings. But the other thing, which isn't often talked about, is that behind closed doors, Deng had a decision to make. It was clear communism wasn't working. If he had tried to hold on to it the way things were, he would have lost power, and China would be a democracy, or China would just be a huge North Korea right now. And so what happened is that Deng started to jumpstart the investment in the West in China. It's not going to be immediate, but he's going to realize that, hey, we can't control the politics and the economy. So what they realize is, they say, he takes a bet. He says, okay, we're going to stay in charge politically, but we got to open up. So the bet he was making is if we make life better for the elites and intellectuals, people will be willing to let us stay in charge. And so far, it's been working. One of the things that's really going to help them is going to be Hong Kong, is going to lose its, in 97, is going to revert back to Chinese control, just as the treaty said. And that is going to help jumpstart the Chinese economy, which is a big issue. Like today, if you look in if you look at what's happened in the last year or two, is communism has started to really enforce themselves in Hong Kong, and we've had all these movements that were standing up against them, and it's not looking good for them right now. So it is a crazy thing to keep track of. Your book mentions how in 2008 is really where people started to wake up and realize how powerful China was becoming. And interestingly, the West in many ways kind of kowtowed to the communists in China. And so, even though your book really doesn't talk about it here, that's a very interesting time to see how powerful China was getting. And also, China made the same bet. Hey, if we can help your economy, you will be willing to let us stay communist and let us rule our country the way it wants. And that is that first subheading.